The terminal was alive with noise, rolling suitcases, fast steps, flight announcements echoing overhead. Yet around Aisha, there was a bubble of silence, one that pressed heavier than the weight of her carry-on. She shifted slightly, hand resting on her swollen stomach, her eyes tired but steady. "Need a hand?" David asked softly, reaching toward her bag. She shook her head, whispering, "No, I can manage." "I don't want them to think—" Her words trailed off. "To think what?" "That I'm asking for too much." David's jaw tightened. He looked around. Strangers passed by without meeting their eyes, though a few let their gazes linger longer than comfort allowed. A couple whispered, glancing back as if her very presence was an inconvenience. Aisha inhaled slowly, stepped forward in line. Her voice when she spoke to the attendant was gentle. "Excuse me, could I get some help lifting this overhead?" The woman in uniform didn't glance at her. "Passengers are expected to handle their own belongings," she replied briskly, already turning to the man behind Aisha. The man smiled awkwardly. Without asking, the attendant reached to take his bag, lifting it with practiced ease. David's hand twitched at his side, but he stayed silent. Aisha lowered her gaze, lips pressed tight. She whispered only to him, words that stung in their smallness. "It's always the same." And in that moment, though the airport remained filled with chatter, the silence around them deepened, not from absence of sound, but from the weight of what was unspoken. David looked at her, then at the attendant, and knew this journey had already begun with a wound. The attendant's hand moved quickly to help the man behind Aisha, her smile polished, warm, practiced. His bag was lifted without hesitation, her voice soft. "Of course, sir. Let me take that for you." Aisha watched the simple exchange, her own request left hanging in the air like a weight. She lowered her eyes, whispering almost to herself. "It wasn't heavy. I just wanted a little kindness." David's hand brushed against hers. He said nothing, but the silence between them spoke of old wounds reopened, a familiar sting returning without surprise. The man she'd been ignored for glanced back at her, uncomfortable. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't mean to cut in." Aisha forced a small smile. "You didn't." Her voice was steady, but the steadiness cost her. The attendant turned back briefly, her polite tone sharpened now. "Ma'am, if you need help, you should plan ahead. We can't always stop to assist." Her words carried no anger, just a cold efficiency that stripped Aisha bare in front of strangers. David's jaw clenched. "You helped him," he said quietly. Not loud enough for the whole line, but enough that the words carried a quiet accusation. The attendant shifted uncomfortably, the smile faltering just for a second before returning to her face. "I'm following procedure." But the truth hung heavy. Procedure had bent the moment privilege appeared. Aisha's eyes lifted to meet the woman's, no anger in them, only fatigue. That gaze unsettled more than shouting ever could. Around them, a hush spread in pockets. Not everyone noticed, but those who did shifted uneasily, sensing something wrong but saying nothing. Aisha whispered to David, "It's not the silence that hurts. It's their smile." David's hand rested on her shoulder, steady but gentle, as though he was holding both her weight and the silence pressing against them. His calmness wasn't weakness, it was armor. Aisha leaned slightly into it, whispering, "Just some water. For the baby." Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from exhaustion. The attendant looked at her as though the request itself was an interruption. "You'll have to wait until service begins," she replied, her tone flat, dismissive. David's eyes lingered on the woman, steady and unblinking. "She's pregnant," he said softly, the kind of quiet that demanded to be heard. The attendant shifted, glancing toward colleagues nearby. They avoided meeting her eyes, pretending to be busy, their silence louder than any refusal. The passengers around them shifted too, some staring, some pretending not to notice. Aisha didn't raise her voice. She repeated almost a prayer, "Water, just water." Her plea carried no anger, only dignity. That dignity unsettled more than rage ever could. The attendant's polished smile cracked. Fine, but don't make demands like this again. She set down a cup of water. The gesture, sharp, meant to remind who held control. Aisha accepted it with trembling hands, whispering, "Thank you." Not because gratitude was owed, but because the child within her mattered more than pride in that moment. David exhaled slowly, the kind of sigh that held centuries of restraint. He didn't argue, didn't shout. His hand tightened just slightly on hers, steadying her against the storm of stares and unspoken judgments. The silence that followed was heavier than any insult. It wasn't about the water. It never had been. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, steady, predictable, until the sound was shattered by something sharper. The slap landed with such force it seemed to steal the air itself. Aisha's head snapped to the side, her breath caught, the sting burning deeper than skin. Gasps broke the silence, quick, startled, then hushed. A child whimpered 2 rows back, silenced quickly by a mother's hand. The passengers froze, their eyes darting between the attendant and the woman she had struck, waiting for someone to speak, someone to move. David's voice came first, low, unshaken. "You hit her." His words were not shouted, yet they carried heavier than any scream. The attendant's hand trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it, clutching her clipboard like a shield. She was being difficult. Aisha turned her face back slowly, the red mark already rising against her brown skin. Her voice was faint but steady. "I asked for water." Those 5 words cut deeper than the slap itself. They hung in the air, undeniable. The man from earlier shifted in his seat, whispering, "This isn't right." But his voice trailed, swallowed by the weight of collective silence. David's eyes never left the attendant. "She is pregnant, and you struck her." Each word was precise, deliberate, holding back a fury that threatened to break. The attendant looked around, searching for support from colleagues, but none would meet her gaze. Their silence was its own verdict. Aisha closed her eyes for a moment, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. The pain was real, but the humiliation was heavier. In that cabin, racism was no longer whispers or quiet refusals. It had drawn blood in the form of a hand across her face. The cabin held its breath. The slap still echoed in the minds of every passenger, but what came after was heavier than sound. Silence, raw and waiting. Aisha's hand remained pressed against her stomach, her body small yet unbroken, her dignity shielding her from collapse. David's chair creaked as he rose, slowly, deliberately. Not a hurried movement, not anger erupting, but a presence unfolding. His height, his calm, his silence drew more fear than if he had shouted. The attendant took a step back. "Sir, please, sit down." Her voice cracked, betraying nerves. David's eyes locked on hers, steady, unflinching. "You touched my wife. You touched my child." Each word landed like weight against the cabin walls. He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The passengers shifted uneasily, whispers trailing, a wave of recognition moving through the rows. The captain's voice crackled faintly from the intercom, unaware of the storm inside. But here, no one heard it. All ears clung to David's measured calm. Aisha looked up at him, her voice faint. "David, sit, please." Not from fear of him, but of what might follow. He glanced down at her, his hand brushing her shoulder, steadying her as much as himself. "No," he whispered, low enough for only her to hear. "Silence has lived long enough." The attendant swallowed, eyes darting to her colleagues for backup. But none stepped forward. Their folded arms, averted gazes, were louder than loyalty. David stood rooted, not demanding, not pleading. Simply present. And in that presence, power shifted. The crew trembled, the passengers leaned forward, and the silence of the oppressed began to rise on his shoulders. The air felt changed, like justice itself had taken its first breath. David did not move. His body was still, shoulders square, eyes steady. The authority in the polished uniforms no longer seemed sharp. It frayed under the weight of his silence. He didn't need to shout. His presence alone was louder than anger. A man in the third row leaned forward, whispering to his wife, "Did she just slap her?" The words carried, slipping from row to row, until the cabin filled with murmurs too soft to be silenced. The lead attendant's face tightened. "Sir, please sit down." "You're disrupting the flight," David's voice came low, measured. "No, I'm witnessing." Passengers turned. Some looked down, uneasy. Others held their phones higher, cameras trembling in their hands. Truth was no longer a secret. Every lens captured it, every whisper spread it further. A woman in the back shook her head, murmuring, "Always the same. Always the silence." Another voice added, "Not today." The crew shifted nervously, eyes darting toward each other, but no one stepped forward. Their silence was not loyalty, it was fear. Fear of being seen, recorded, remembered. Aisha sat quietly, one hand still on her stomach, the other gripping the armrest. Her eyes met David's. He gave the slightest nod, grounding her. The flight hummed on, but the atmosphere had shifted. What had been authority now looked fragile. What had been silence was now breaking, thread by thread, through whispers that no uniform could control. And still, David stood. One man, unshaken, while an entire crew struggled to hold on to power that was already slipping from their hands. The cabin had changed. It was no longer theirs. David's eyes didn't leave the trembling attendant, yet his mind slipped elsewhere. Memories didn't ask for permission. They came flooding, jagged and sharp. He saw his father in a courtroom, shoulders hunched, voice steady but unheard. The judge's gavel had fallen, not on justice, but on silence. David was just a boy then, watching dignity swallowed by a system that never listened. His breath hitched. Another memory, Aisha sitting in a clinic years ago, her pain brushed aside by a nurse who wouldn't look her in the eye. He remembered her whisper after they left, "They didn't even see me." The sound of shuffling feet in the cabin snapped him back. But the ghosts stayed, David muttered, almost to himself. "It's always the same." The lead attendant stiffened. "Excuse me?" He looked at her, eyes steady. "You think this is about today?" "It's not. It's about every time someone like you thought we wouldn't stand." Passengers grew still. A man cleared his throat but said nothing. The whispers had died, replaced by something heavier. Recognition. David's voice lowered. "You didn't just slap my wife. You slapped every time they said we didn't belong, every time they turned their face away." The attendant's lips parted, but no words came. Beside him, Aisha's fingers found his hand. She squeezed once, firm, steady. Narration moved in like a shadow. The slap was not an isolated wound. It carried the weight of generations, a history that refused to stay buried. For David, silence was no longer an option, and for the first time, the crew seemed to understand. They weren't facing one man, but every ghost that stood behind him. The cabin's silence no longer felt empty. It carried judgment. Every breath, every shift of a seat became part of an unspoken verdict. A pen scratched against paper. Near the aisle, a young reporter, quiet until now, began scribbling furiously. Her eyes lifted, meeting David's for a brief second, as if to say, "This will not be buried." From the back, an older man leaned toward his wife. His whisper cut through the air. "Always the same." He didn't mean today. He meant every yesterday like it. The attendant flinched at the words, though they weren't directed at her. Authority, once untouchable, now bent beneath stares that would not look away. A mother hushed her child, but her own eyes stayed fixed on Aisha, on the mark still blooming across her cheek. She didn't speak, but her tightened jaw said enough. David's voice was low, steady. "You see them watching? They won't forget. You can erase reports, but you can't erase eyes." The lead attendant swallowed hard. "Sir, please sit down." "For your safety." His response came without raising his tone. "For hers." That's the only safety that matters now. Narration edged in like breath on glass. The truth didn't rise in shouts. It spread in careful looks, in reluctant nods, in murmurs that crept through the rows like wildfire under cloth. Each passenger became a witness, unwilling or not. The airline's script unraveled before their eyes, replaced by something heavier. Evidence. And in that fragile stillness, power shifted. The crew no longer held the cabin. The passengers did. Their silence had turned into testimony. The murmurs had weight now. They weren't just about this moment. They pulled from something older, something buried. Truth was crawling back. David's voice was quiet, but each word landed heavy. "This isn't the first time, is it?" The lead attendant stiffened. "Sir, Her name's been there before," he cut in. His eyes didn't leave Clark, the woman whose hand had struck his wife. "You've protected her. You've called it a misunderstanding. How many?" Clark's lips parted, but no defense came. Only silence, and silence told more than words. From the corner, the reporter whispered into her recorder. Pattern of complaints. Settled quietly. An elderly passenger leaned forward, his voice trembling. "I remember her. 2 years ago. Same arrogance. Different woman." His wife touched his sleeve, urging quiet, but his eyes held fire. Clark's composure cracked. "This is being exaggerated." "No!" Aisha finally spoke, her voice steady despite the sting on her cheek. "This is what happens when arrogance keeps getting covered. You hit and they hide it. You humiliate and they pay silence." Narration brushed through like a wind in stale air. The airline's gleaming image was built not on trust, but on the quiet burying of stories like this. Lawsuits settled in conference rooms, apologies drafted for press but never meant for hearts, offenders shielded behind uniforms. David's words fell sharp. "You've silenced others. You won't silence this." For the first time, Clark lowered her eyes. Her authority had slipped, not because he shouted, but because the weight of her past was heavier than her power in the present. The cabin no longer watched a single slap. They watched an empire of denial start to crumble. The cabin had already shifted, but when David finally spoke, the shift became irreversible. His voice was calm, stripped of everything except truth. "You touched my wife," he said, steady, each syllable unshakable. His gaze didn't waver. "You touched my child." The words hung in the air, heavier than any shout could ever be. A hush spread, so complete that the hum of the engines sounded like thunder. Clark tried to speak, but her mouth opened into silence. For the first time, her authority wasn't questioned. It was gone. "Sir, we ask you to lower your tone," the lead attendant murmured, voice trembling. David didn't raise his eyes to him. "I don't need to raise it. You heard me." Narration threaded through the stillness. It wasn't anger that broke the illusion of control. It was restraint. Dignity turned into steel, and in that moment, every passenger knew whose voice carried weight. Aisha's hand brushed David's arm, a reminder of presence, of shared strength. She whispered, almost only for him. "Enough." But her words weren't to silence, only to steady. An older woman, seated a few rows away, whispered to no one in particular, "That's the voice of every man who's had enough." The reporter lifted her pen, no longer scribbling but pausing, as if the story was already writing itself. Clark lowered her head slightly, her silence a crack in the wall she had always hidden behind. David leaned back just an inch, his eyes never leaving her. "This doesn't end here. You don't get to walk away from this one." The cabin didn't move, didn't breathe. The world had just been told a truth it could no longer pretend not to hear. The cabin hadn't recovered when the first phone lit up. A passenger, hands trembling, replayed the sound of the slap. Another passed it along. By the time the wheels touched down, silence had already given way to screens. A whisper spread. "It's online." David helped Aisha to her feet, steady, protective. He didn't glance at the recording, but others did. Faces pale, some ashamed, some relieved. On the ground, reporters waited before the airline even issued a statement. Hashtags flooded timelines. "Justice for Aisha. No more silence." "Sir, please," Clark stammered, cornered by flashing lights. "You don't understand." David cut in quietly, almost tired. "The world understands enough." Narration folded through the noise. One slap had escaped the cabin. Now it lived in millions of hands, a truth impossible to bury under polished press releases. Crowds gathered within hours. Airports, City streets, chants echoing the words David had spoken. "You touched my wife. You touched my child." A young student outside held a cardboard sign. "This isn't just their fight," she told the camera. Her voice shook, but her eyes didn't. Inside the airline headquarters, executives watched footage loop again and again. Every replay was a verdict. Every hashtag a reminder that silence could no longer be bought. Passengers from that day gave interviews. "I saw it," one said firmly. No misunderstanding. Just cruelty. Their testimonies became bricks, building pressure against walls that once seemed unshakable. Clark tried to retreat into statements, legal lines, half apologies. But the internet does not forget, and this time, neither would the world. It wasn't noise that carried the story. It was repetition. Every share, every voice, every screen replaying the moment until even power itself had to tremble. The wooden doors closed, shutting out the noise of protesters and cameras. Inside, the air was heavier. Clark sat rigid, flanked by lawyers in sharp suits. She tried to look untouchable, but the sweat on her palms betrayed her. The judge's voice broke the silence. "Ms. Clark, do you deny striking the plaintiff?" Clark shifted. It was a misunderstanding. Pressure. The flight was tense. Her words stumbled, polished edges slipping. A reporter's pen stopped mid-scratch, waiting. Across the room, David reached for Aisha's hand. They didn't speak. Their stillness was its own testimony. The judge leaned forward. "A misunderstanding does not leave bruises." Clark's throat tightened. Her lawyer whispered, but she shook her head, forcing words. I didn't mean harm." Her excuses sounded smaller in the echoing chamber, like fragile glass trying not to break. Narration threaded through the silence. Power unravels not always in screams, but in stammers, in eyes searching for exits where none exist. David finally spoke, soft, measured. "We're not here for her ruin. We're here for the truth." The courtroom shifted. Even those who came neutral leaned slightly toward him. Clark noticed. Her voice cracked. "You don't understand what I was facing that day." Aisha raised her eyes for the first time. Calm, unflinching. "We've lived what you were facing all our lives." The line landed heavier than any argument. A hush spread, reporters frozen, pens waiting for her next breath. Clark looked down, unable to meet their eyes. For the first time, she was smaller than the silence around her. The gavel struck, not as an ending, but as the sound of arrogance collapsing under its own weight. Before the gavel landed, her face told the truth the law could only circle around. Clark's lips trembled as though each word she once rehearsed now betrayed her. Her eyes darted from the judge to the crowd, searching for someone, anyone, to hold her gaze. None did. Aisha sat unmoved, her hands steady on her lap. The silence around her wasn't empty. It was filled with generations of voices that had been pushed aside. Clark finally whispered almost to herself, "I didn't mean... I wasn't..." The words crumbled before they found shape. David leaned forward, voice even. "This was never just about one flight. You struck her, but you struck every woman who ever had to stay quiet to survive." The sentence didn't need ink. It was already etched on Clark's paling skin. Narration pressed gently into the stillness. Sometimes the punishment isn't carved in years or fines. Sometimes it's the unraveling, the weight of knowing the world has seen through you. Aisha's eyes lifted, soft but firm. "You think I sat here for me?" "No. I carried every silenced woman into this room. You didn't slap one. You slapped us all." The reporters didn't move, pens hovering in stunned air. Clark's chin fell to her chest. No jury, no verdict could strike harder than being measured against that truth. The judge cleared his throat, readying formal words. But the real verdict had already landed. Everyone knew it. When the gavel struck, it wasn't the sound of authority. It was the sound of a mask breaking, dignity stripped by dignity's quiet mirror. Clark didn't look up again. Her sentence was written where everyone could read it, on her face. The silence she once demanded now wrapped itself around her like chains. Clark scrolled through her phone at night, each notification another stone thrown from strangers who now knew her face, her name, her cruelty. The screen glowed, but no messages of comfort appeared. Only venom, only reminders. Her daughter's number blinked unanswered. The voicemail was short, clipped, and cold. "I can't defend you. Stop calling." Clark replayed it as if repetition could change its meaning. It never did. In the kitchen, the phone rang once, an old friend. She snatched it up too quickly. The voice on the other end sighed. "Linda, you made your bed. I can't be seen with you now." Then the line cut. Clark leaned against the wall, whispering to no one. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I was respected, I was feared. But respect had never been hers, only borrowed power, granted by a system that had finally turned its back. Narration settled where words failed. She had ordered silence for others, bought it with arrogance, forced it with position. Now silence was all she had, and it was merciless. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid her eyes. At the grocery store, whispers traveled faster than her footsteps. Even the cashier handed change without meeting her gaze. At night, the house groaned louder than before. Loneliness has a way of amplifying walls, of making rooms echo with every unspoken regret. Her arrogance hadn't been stripped by a company's decision. It had been erased, piece by piece, by the very world she once believed would protect her. Now, the woman who silenced others lived inside the silence she could never escape. The noise around them grew louder. Headlines, interviews, protests, trending hashtags. But Aisha and David walked through it as if it belonged to another world. Their hands stayed linked, not in defiance, but in grounding, as though every step was a reminder. Survival itself was victory. Reporters crowded outside the hospital when their daughter was born, microphones reaching like hands desperate for a story. David shielded the car door, voice calm. No comment. Aisha's soft eyes met the cameras for a moment, then dropped back to her child. She didn't need to speak. The baby's cry was louder than any explanation. Inside the quiet of their home, they spoke little about the trial, the slap, or the woman whose name the world now mocked. Their words belonged to smaller things, night feedings, lullabies, which blanket was softer. That was their revolution, dignity in the ordinary. One evening, David sat watching his daughter sleep. His voice broke the stillness. "We didn't win in court. We won here." Aisha nodded, her palm resting gently on the child's chest. "They wanted us angry. We gave them silence. They wanted a fight. We gave them life." Narration filled the space their words left. Not all victories are loud. Some carry no applause, no headlines, no speeches. They live in the hush of a newborn's breath, in the quiet between two hands that refuse to let go. Outside, the world debated justice and punishment. Inside, justice was already alive, wrapped in a blanket, cradled by arms that had endured humiliation and still chose love over bitterness. They hadn't asked for fame. They had asked only for dignity. And in the soft light of their home, they finally had it. The boardrooms filled before sunrise. Men in sharp suits and women with rehearsed voices shuffled papers, pretending control. But every sentence carried the weight of failure. Clark's name was no longer just a scandal. It was a mirror they couldn't escape. "Damage control," one executive muttered. "No," another whispered. "This isn't damage control. This is survival." Outside, cameras still flashed, but inside, decisions grew smaller, softer. Training manuals were rewritten. Posters of diversity pledges covered old walls, fragile as bandages. Change had come, not with marches outside glass towers, but with one quiet truth that refused to leave the room. At home, David sat by the window, rocking his daughter in silence. He wasn't watching the news anymore, though every channel repeated his words. Aisha folded tiny clothes, her voice barely above a breath. "You think they'll really change?" David's hand paused on the cradle. His eyes carried both doubt and hope. "Justice doesn't always roar," he said slowly, as though speaking to himself. "Sometimes it whispers, and the world still hears it." Narration seeped between their silence. The reforms came not from goodwill, but from fear. fear of exposure, fear of truth too loud to bury. Yet even fear had power to shift mountains when shame refused to die quietly. The slap that was meant to silence her had instead left a permanent echo, not thunderous, not fiery, but steady, like a heartbeat that could not be ignored. And so the system, built on arrogance, began to tremble at a whisper.